It's probably not by the title or the name, but how about this? Let's see, how does it go? Today, what is it? Today upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go. I used to tell that one to my younger sister. She would like me thrilled. So how do we think about a man who isn't there on the stair, right? Well, it's like concepts like square circle. Okay, I can say the words, I can give you a formula, right? Or unmarried, married bachelor. There you go, married bachelor. I can give you that as a formula of words. You sort of know what it means, but you also realize that the parts of the definition like are fighting each other. In philosophy, we say they're inconsistent or incoherent or both, right? Inconsistency means they cannot both be true at the same time, and incoherence means there are problems that they pull in other directions, right? But focusing on a concept like square circle, well, let me put it to you like this. Suppose you're on a grant committee and you're reviewing proposals, and I ask you for $100,000 so that I can take an expedition to look for square circles. What are you likely to say to me? You're likely to say, we're not going to give you $100,000 to look for square circles because I can settle that for you now. If it's square, it's not a circle, and if it's a circle, it's not a square. Therefore, the concept itself of square circle cannot apply to you because the concept falls apart. It's internally inconsistent. Okay, makes sense so far? Okay, so what this means is that there are some definitions that look like definitions that may even be meaningful to you, like that man who's on the stair who isn't there. It's not that it's not meaningful, it's just that that formula, if you try to treat it like a definition, it pulls itself apart from the inside because it's internally inconsistent. A married bachelor, same kind of thing. If you're married, you can't be a bachelor. If you're a bachelor, they're internally inconsistent. Okay? Okay, so the word in philosophy we use for a concept that could apply to something is viable. A concept is viable when it meets the logical requirements such that it could apply to something in the world. That's why we don't have a problem giving a definition of a unicorn. We can give a definition of a unicorn that's internally consistent and coherent, which means that it could apply to something if there happened to be any. It's just that there aren't any, right? But that's not like the concept of a square circle because it could not apply to anything because it's internally inconsistent. Okay, this is the reason I'm sort of dwelling on this is because this is the crucial turn in the line of thought. So now, speaking of turning, if we turn to the concept of God, then a conceptual atheist position is that in order for us to answer any kind of question about believing in God or the existence of God, we have to go through a kind of a protocol, right? If you unpack this philosophically. So what's protocol? Well, first, we have to have a definition so that we know what would count as one of these things. Because it would make no sense for the definition to be so open and loosey-goosey that anything counts, right? Because then we would have a sort of a failure of communication. It would be like, I'm willing to count dogs with paper cones glued to their heads as a unicorn. Well, I might be willing to sort of, play that game, but it doesn't mean unicorns exist, right? So first we have to have a definition so that we know what would count as God. Second, the definition itself has to pass these logical requirements. It has to be internally consistent and coherent so that it could apply to something, or in philosophy shorthand, the concept has to be viable. Okay, and then we have to have a next step, which is an epistemological or an empirical step, which is we have to see whether that concept that is determined to be viable actually applies to something. Okay? So The position of conceptual atheism is that the concepts of God, I'm going to do this in the first person because I'm one of these, so I'll just tell you, okay? So, as a conceptual atheist, what my claim is that the concepts of God that I'm familiar with don't pass the logical test. And therefore, it makes no sense to go on and ask whether this exists, for the same reason that if you were on a grants committee, you wouldn't give me $100,000 to look for square circles. We can settle that. Yeah, talk to me.
Aren't there a million concepts of what God is?
That's exactly
right. How do you
right.
reconcile all that?
This is how you reconcile it. I don't know. Tomorrow, I mean, so far in my life, I've been teaching philosophy nearly 40 years. I've never come across a definition that isn't internally flawed. But tomorrow, or later today, or one of you might walk up to me after this thing and give me a definition that passes logical tests, in which case then we're in a position to ask whether that thing exists. So it is not a closed position. It's an open position. So I'm going to come back to that in just a minute because you've jumped 3 steps ahead in my outline. But let me give you a few of the arguments for the internal inconsistency, okay? Because this is an important part of this. It's one thing for me to say the concepts of God don't make any sense, or like square circle, let's move on. It's another thing to do the intellectual work of specifying what goes wrong. That's important in philosophy because we don't want to just assume that Matthew's right and move on. All right. So there is the sort of foundational idea of God in Western theology, in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theology. The foundational idea is a definition of God that we refer to in philosophy of religion, we refer to as classical theism. Classical theism has these ingredients, okay? It's a being that's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, that's an odd word, but it means willing only good, so perfectly good. Personhood, and generally supremacy, like it's a supreme being of some kind. But the general argument is that if it has this is my nickname for it, students, the 3 O's, right? If it has the 3 O's, then it has to be supreme in terms of being a supreme being because it's like perfect power, perfect knowledge, right? So a lot of philosophers, okay, students, cue up the problem of evil. A lot of philosophers have pointed out that on the surface of it, it looks like there's a conflict, a consistency problem between God's omnipotence, like God can do anything, and God's omnibenevolence. And here's the inconsistency. Wouldn't it be the case that since God can only do good, then there are a bunch of things that God cannot do that God would otherwise be able to do being omnipotent. So isn't there a conflict between these two things? Some philosophers have concluded that that inconsistency is serious enough to render the classic theist concept of God not viable, which means it couldn't exist anyway, so there's no sense looking, right? In other words, the argument is that it's more like the concept square circle than it is the concept unicorn, okay? And you know, there's a lot of, my students in here, you're gonna know that there's a lot of arguments that on both sides of this, like there's an argument for inconsistency, there's a bunch of arguments that try to show that somehow there is a compatibility between God's omnipotence and God's omnibenevolence. Leibniz, you know, I mean, so we could talk about that, but we're not going to. My students have had a massive dose of that this semester, so they probably had enough. But I want to talk a little bit about so the typical move is to play different aspects of God's nature off against each other, like in this case, omnipotence versus omnibenevolence. But you could also think about omnibenevolence versus omniscience. Like if God knows everything, is there anything that you can do to change what God already knows? And if it's not the case that you could do anything now that would change something God knows, then can God really be perfectly good? Because that means that God has already determined your fate before you've had a chance to do anything by knowing what you're going to do. So there are a number of different approaches to this issue that leverage one of the traits against another one. But I think there's a pretty powerful argument to be made that even the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. And I want to give you a little taste of this argument. It goes like this, okay? Have any of you ever heard of the paradox of the stone? So this is one of those things that people in philosophy classes or bars sit around and think about a good bit. Could God create a stone that's too heavy for God to lift? Okay, so think about it. It's kind of a funny story in one way, because if God can create a stone that's too heavy for God to lift, and God is omnipotent, then God should be able to lift any stone, no matter what. So what it looks like is that God is, putting some kind of limitation on what God can do. I think the fascination we have with the paradox of it as a kind of a philosophy parlor trick in bars. I've gotten some good mileage out of this in bars, but I think it obscures a deeper and in one way more interesting issue. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. There are actions that are doable, right? Things that some being can do. The claim of omnipotence is, if you've ever had a logic class, it's a universal quantifier, right? It's like if anything is doable, God can do it. Okay. But what about this? There are actions that are doable, but doing one of them precludes doing some other thing. So, like for instance, you've all heard this one: you can't have your cake and eat. What that means is that if you have a piece of cake and you eat it, you can't have it. And if you have it and you want to keep having it, you can't eat it. So let's call these, in true philosophical form, non-compossible doables. So it's plausible to think that there are at least some things in the world, some actions that are doable that preclude doing something else. That's why we say non-compossible. Okay. Well, now think about this. If there are any non-compossible doables, then God can do one of them or the other one, but not both of them, because that creates a logical inconsistency. But if God cannot do something because of what God did, then that means that God's omnipotence is limited, which means that God is not omnipotent, just really potent, right? But that's not part of, what we want in the classic theist definition of God is omnipotence means that God can do anything, perfect power, absolute power. So there's some reason to think that the classic theist concept of God has an internal consistency problem. And if it has an internal consistency problem, then that puts it in the category more like married bachelor or square circle, which means that there's no point to asking the question of existence. That's where I come down on all of the concepts of God, the possible, now of all the possible concepts with their definitions that I'm aware of so far. And it's a big world out there. So I'm also including concepts of the divine from, for instance, classical Indian philosophy, like Advaita Vedanta. I mean, there's a big world, but of all the ones I'm aware of, I see logical problems with all of them that would preclude us getting to the question of existence. Not all of them are about internal inconsistency. Some of the problems that I see are about coherence. The coherence problem is a little harder to get your head around, but think about this. If we think about a unicorn um, as a vertebrate and a quadruped in the sense that it has four legs, but the front legs are facing forward like the head and the rear legs are facing backward like the tail, that is a coherence problem. The parts don't all cohere together to create a unity. So there could be problems about coherence, even if it's not an outright inconsistency. I can't resist doing this because I have students here. I'm also going to make a nod in the direction of Anselm. Anselm's famous ontological argument it's a contender. Anselm is a really good philosopher, and he argues that God must exist because the definition of God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if we think through, and the reason I'm putting this on the table is because I actually have a lot of respect for Anselm. Anselm, in a way, weirdly tries to respond to my critique 1,000 years before I was born, right? So it's really interesting. I still think he's wrong, but I think it's an interesting argument. So think about this. If we leave everything out of the concept of God except one thing, and remember, we've already talked about this because we could give a definition of dog that leaves out some things that we really like dogs to have, but what we're really talking about is an essential trait. So Anselm argues that there's only one essential defining trait of God, and that is that God is a being than which none greater can be conceived. So now what does that mean for those of you who weren't in class? It means that no matter what being is doing the thinking, God is a being that is so great that that being cannot think of something greater. That's like supremacy on steroids, right? Because even God, with God's mind, couldn't think of a being greater than God. So it doesn't, what this definition does is it avoids the problem of indexing the definition of God to a human mind by sort of going in the back door. So he gets lots of extra credit for addressing the problem of not indexing the concept of God to a human mind, because that would be a problem. Like, what's the best being that you and I could imagine, right? I mean, that's like espresso, right? So, speaking of it, he solves that problem in a really nice way, and then the rest of the argument is that any being that meets this criterion of being that which none greater can be conceived would have to exist as well. And here's why. Because you just saw me drink a little bit of espresso, and you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, ooh, some espresso would be really nice about now. But you know what would be even nicer than the thought that you're having that you're thinking about espresso would be like if you actually had some. In other words, existing espresso is going to be superior to the fantasy espresso that you're thinking about now because you just saw me drink some, right? And so if we apply that principle that existence is better than non-existence, then any being that meets the criterion of being that than which none greater can be conceived would have to exist as well. I like that argument because it avoids consistency problems. It has a different fatal flaw that is articulated by a monk called Galmilan, which is that, and then it was amplified later by Kant, the philosophy thing. But essentially it goes like this. There's nothing in the concept of the espresso that you're thinking of that isn't also in the actual espresso. It's just that the actual espresso is an individual example instantiating that concept. Or to put it in more fancy philosophical terms, existence is not a predicate like hot or pretty or tasty. It's In fact, it's not a predicate at all. It is a condition that's met when the thing actually applies to something real. And if that definition does apply to something real, then it exists. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't. So the way I understand Anselm's argument is it's saying if God exists, then God would exist as a being than which none greater can be conceived. But there's still no guarantee that the being has to exist. We have to just go see if it exists, if there's a sufficient coherence. Yeah, talk to me.
So is immateriality a part of the definition?
It generally has been, like in philosophy and philosophical theology, it has been, but there's a reason why that is. Because if we think about God as being an infinite being, which is the traditional move, right? All of the omni words, the O's, they all assume an infinite magnitude, right? And if we do, and we add materiality to that, then we've got really serious coherence problems because, okay, so for instance, if God exists and God's a material being that's infinite, wouldn't it squeeze out all the other, like nothing else could exist? But all of this other stuff exists that is not God, so how could all of this stuff exist if God is an infinite material being that occupies like infinite? You see where that's going.
So
Yeah.
if God or whatever is immaterial, how does an immaterial thing affect the material world?
That is a really interesting question, and it's one of a long list of coherence problems that I think we have a right to reflect on about concepts of God. Like, how does God bring about something in the material world that doesn't happen through material cause, right? And here there's been some really interesting. There's been some really interesting examples. There's a John Duns Scotus was a metaphysician, medieval guy, and he made an argument that God's. So go with me here because I realize how this sounds. I am bringing this up for effect, right? But his argument is that God's ability to bring about change in the material world is like the evil eye, oculus mali. It's action at a distance that doesn't have an intervening material cause. So you have to postulate that there is some non-physical but causal explanation, and therein lies the conceptual rub, right? Because cause is an inherently material concept. So if you're postulating a non-material cause, then you're postulating something that's like square circle, and now we're back to conceptual atheism.
And many persons I say they get around that by saying, well, it's energy. The thing is that energy is a thing. So they have a stated on it.
No, that's absolutely right. Trying to dodge, it's sort of like trying to dodge the philosophical problem by jumping into a sort of pseudoscientific reading of energy. But here's the interesting thing though, now kind of back to your point, I'm open to the possibility that tomorrow or next year or next millennium, we will have the ability to detect forms of energy that we can't detect now that might turn out to provide a scientific basis for things like, I don't know, what, ESP, telekinesis. I mean, it could be. I don't think it's very likely, but it could happen. And if it does happen, then you know what's going to happen is things that we formerly thought were supernatural are going to turn out to be natural, just like Hume argued. If we had the evidence for these things, that would put them on a footing with the kind of scientific materialist explanations that we have for other things, then it would just be part of science. It wouldn't be part of, theology or whatever, right? there'd still be philosophical problems, so don't fall into the trap of thinking that when our science gets good enough, philosophical problems come to an end, because they don't. And I can illustrate that like really quickly and easily, and that is science makes the presumption that the laws of nature are homogeneous with respect to, the laws throughout the universe. But how do we know that's true? How do we know that the laws that operate here operate in the Andromeda galaxy 2,200,000 light years away? We haven't been there. All we've done is collect a few meager photons and extrapolate it. We're not gonna go there because it would take 2,200,000 years at the speed of light to get there. And when you got there, it'd be gone anyway, because the light that left there is 2,200,000 years old. So the entire enterprise of science is based on a philosophical presumption that reality is homogeneous with respect to its traits throughout all of reality. So science is not going to save us from philosophical problems, except, we can ignore it. You can always ignore it. One of the things I say in my intro to philosophy class, you don't like Descartes, you can always refute Descartes by just closing the book. But that's not actually a rational refutation. It's just I've decided to play ostrich about it. But let's pick up now back to our outline. So it should be becoming more clear what the position of conceptual atheism is about. So now let's go back to our question our simple looking question that we started with. It turns out that there are actually more answers than just the three, yes, no, and don't know, or not sure, right? Let's focus on atheism, right? I had as an undergrad at Southwestern University, I had the good fortune, we'll call it, of having dinner with Madeleine Murray O'Hair. Yeah, she was fascinating. In many ways, she was really fascinating. But at one point in our conversation, a 20-year-old me said to her, so you don't believe in God. I don't believe in God. So you believe that God does not exist. I believe that God does not exist. I was like, well, how do you define? I was already moving in this direction, but how do you define this thing? And she was really unpleasant. And she said, I define it like everybody else defines this a supreme being. So there is an example of somebody who is convinced that God does not exist and also doesn't think about the question of how we define God as being pertinent somehow. Because, well, everybody knows what you mean by God. That's the thing that doesn't exist, right? Let's call that kind of atheism positive atheism. And why positive? It's positive because it's a specific assertion. I have a concept of God. I believe, or I'm going to operate like that concept is viable. And I'm going to claim that that thing does not exist. So the position that a positive atheist is in is the unicorn position. Have a concept of the unicorn. The concept could apply to something, but it doesn't. So that's it's a positive claim about what exists in the world. So I like to use the word positive for that. So in a way, you could call my position negative atheism, but I like conceptual atheism better. And the reason I like conceptual atheism better is it identifies where in the process things go awry. It's at the level of the concept. So if concepts of God that have come along are more like married bachelor or square circle or the man who wasn't there, if they're in that category, then we don't make any claims about existence because there aren't any made. So at the very least, there's now more answers to the question, do you believe in God? I mean, a theist answer is going to involve these claims. I have a concept of God. The concept is viable, and it also applies to a being, like in reality. That's a theist position. Now, what that concept is, we would have to investigate because, as I mentioned, it's a very big world out there. Even in the history of Christian theology, there's been disputes and arguments about the essential traits of God. And if you want one really interesting example, you could think about God as a Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity in Christian theology is a claim about the essential nature of God, three persons in one being. You know, it's enshrined in, for instance, the Athanasian Creed, blah, blah. I mean, there's a whole history behind this, right? So even in one single tradition, there's been some dispute about the essential traits that would define God. So you can imagine if you broaden your scope, to the world, you're going to have a lot of diversity about that. So a person who's a theist would presumably would have some particular concept of God in mind, or should have, or they're presupposing it, and then they're claiming viability and also existence, right? Okay, so we have two flavors of atheism now. What about agnosticism, the people who aren't sure? Well, there's a couple of different things you could be not sure about. You could be not sure that this one particular concept of God actually applies to something. That's more like what I think of as the agnostic position. In other words, I have a concept of God. The concept is viable, but I'm not sure whether it applies. But another way to be kind of agnostic is to admit up front, I don't know what all the possible definitions of God might be, so I can't answer all of them. But in that case, my argument is that that kind of I'm not sure is really what I'm talking about, because conceptual atheism is this open-ended position. I have not examined every possible definition of God, so I can't make a generic, like a blanket statement about God's existence, because that would be inaccurate. So when people ask me, do you believe in God? I can't say no, because if I say no, then we have to know what concept of God we're talking about, and then I have to go through the process. But it's an open-ended issue, so there could be concepts of God I haven't considered. So no is inaccurate. Yes is weird, because you can't say you believe in God if you don't think you can get to the question of existence, because the possible concepts of God that you've entertained so far and analyzed have turned out to be not viable, right? So here's what I say, and I say this partly for dramatic effect and partly because it usually starts a conversation, which I'm conversation with somebody about something. Been like that all my life. My sisters used to mock and make fun of me because I would capture people and ask them about their belief system when I was a kid. I mean, it's like I've always been obsessed with this stuff, right? So here's what I say. Matthew, do you believe in God? I say, I have no beliefs at all about God. Now, that may sound like I'm just being evasive, but if you think about it, it's actually true. I don't have a belief about a concept of God that's internally inconsistent any more than I have a belief in square circles. I don't have a belief in square circles. I have no beliefs about square circles because there aren't any to believe about. So in that sense, it's true, but it sounds like some kind of, spaceball salute answer, and sometimes that gets me in a conversation.
How is
Yeah.
that different from being agnostic? Because I think what you're saying is that you're not shutting the door on it, that there's a possibility
Yes.
that in some form or shape it exists.
It is similar to the agnostic position in that way, but most agnostics think they know what would count as God. They just aren't sure there is one. But what I'm saying is, I'm not sure what would even count as God, because the concepts that I've been examined so far are like square circles. They couldn't exist even if we wanted one. Yep.
So what do you think about the Einsteinian or Spinozan view of God, that it's essentially the sum total of the laws of the universe?
Yeah, Spinoza is a
Call
really
it a God, but it's not a person.
Funny you should say that, because here's my response to Spinoza. If I could only, have a 1-800 or a 1-900, I would take a 1-900. I wouldn't mind. It'd be worth it. What I'd say to Spinoza is, dude, why go to the trouble? We have a perfectly good word for what you're talking about, and that word is the universe of reality. Let's just reduce the overhead. But the thing is that Spinoza, in his own time, had reasons for the position that he was taking, and he's worth reading. Spinoza is actually really worth reading. He's one of the great. In philosophy, I'm reputed to be an expert on metaphysical systems. That's my. Everybody reads that, right? And so Spinoza, I really like Spinoza's system. I just think the terminology, by the time you redefine God as the sum total of all the operative explanatory principles of the universe, we have a perfectly good word for that. We could use nature, we could use universe. How about reality? That'll work, okay? There's no reason to use a loaded word. And then the other thing to think about with Spinoza is God does not have most of the traits that we associate with the classic theist notion of God anyway. So what is he really up to if he's changing the definition of God to the point that it's not recognizably like? That would be like if I said to you, I'm sorry I'm late for the meeting. I was walking my dog. And it's always hard after he eats because, with no legs, he just sort of slid around. Plus, there's that big lump that he swallows. And if this conversation went on, you'd probably say, so in fact, you have a snake, not a dog. And I said to you, oh, I know, I call him a dog. Well, what would be the point of, all it does is it just reduces intelligibility to rename something and basically remove all of the essential traits. So I'm not a fan. That's Humpty Dumptyism, by the way. But that scene in Through the Looking Glass when Alice gets offended at Humpty Dumpty because Humpty Dumpty uses a word and she says, that's not what that word means. And Humpty Dumpty says, that's the way I mean it. It's just a question of who's in charge. So, I wonder why we need to go down that road. Well, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
That reminds me of New Agers because when they talk about stuff, I'm wondering what they're talking about. If they're atheists or not, they don't never use the term God usually. They say things like source energy or the universe. So atheists believe in the universe. So are we talking about atheists and New Agers talking about the same thing? Source energy, is that another word for God? Are they equivocating? So it makes me wonder about that too.
Yeah, I can't really answer that. I don't. I know that people. If you're interested in this as an empirical question, there's been some really good research on deinstitutionalization, like what people are leaving institutional organized religions, especially in the mid to late 20th century. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean they're becoming less religious in a broad sense. It means that their religiosity is expressed in a different way. So, it used to be that being religious meant that you were a member of some, it's like whatever it is. But now people are more likely to say in that movement, I'm not a member of any religion, but I'm a spiritual person. But the problem with it is that it's kind of like me walking my dog down. Closer scrutiny is actually a snake. What do they mean? What do you mean by spiritual when you say spiritual? Because there's a range. Wicca is spiritual in that sense, but they generally believe in nature spirits. So it's a really tricky issue to generalize about. What we'd have to do is do some one-on-one conversations and surveys and find out what people actually think.
So equivocation is a problem with definitions.
Exactly. If you're not clear or you don't know how you're using a word, meaning what the essential traits are. And come on, let's face it, most of us, languages speak us more than we speak them, right? I mean, we just use words and we don't generally pause to consider. But in philosophy, we actually want to know what we're talking about to the extent we can. And so we pay a whole lot of attention to questions about definition so that we can avoid equivocation. And by the way, equivocation is a fallacy of substituting. Basically, you could call it slippery definition. It's when a definition slips into something else. And it happens all the time. We're swimming in an ocean of equivocation. Like you have people arguing about poverty, like poverty in the United States is horrible. It's the worst problem facing. Actually, poverty in the United States is not bad. But on closer scrutiny, the two people are defining poverty differently. So they're not actually talking about the same thing. They're just screaming at each other with different
It's
words.
simple as when you go order a latte. I'll have a latte.
Yeah.
A milky one.
Yeah, right.
Milk. But then there's like this barrage of different milks.
That's right. That's right. My current challenge with ordering coffee is I want I want an Americano, but I want an Americano made from a European perspective, which is about the same amount of hot water as there is volume, So like if you have 3 ounces of espresso, I want 3 ounces of water. It's inconceivable in America. Like they fill it up. Are you having this problem too? I saw a face of recognition on you.
No,
Anyway.
sorry, I was just, I wanted to ask a question, like,
Yeah.
so when it comes to like the definition of God, the definition of religion, most of that understanding is just kind of based on like the Western understanding, because that's what's been passed along.
Big problem.
And so what I was considering is, well, what about like the Eastern definition of God?
That's right.
And then we start to go into like, oh, well, they don't even actually use that word all that often as the Western does. And so when you brought up that analogy with like the dog and the snake, it's like, oh, well, you're describing like a snake. It made me think of like this analogy with like a hammer. It's like this tool was designed only to hammer nails. Well, somebody's using a hammer to climb a tree.
Right.
Even though that wasn't its purpose, they're still able to use it in a way
Yeah.
that is unconventional, but it still is working.
Yeah.
Not the way you expect though, but they're using
Right.
it in a different way.
Right. But the simple fact that we designate some uses of a hammer as unconventional means that there's still a core of meaning that we could, that's like the home base meaning. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be, it's like what I mentioned about the definition of dog. Definition of dog is the essential traits that are necessary for something to count as a dog. But that thing could have lots of like other traits, right? Yeah. But don't lose your train of thought. Sorry, I don't mean to do this. You students of mine, we're talking about, we just finished up pluralism. And one of the fundamental challenges of pluralism is the question of whether, and you hear people say this all the time, all the religions of the world are really talking about the same underlying truths. In some sense, it may be true, but the sense that is true is so empty and vacuous. So like, for instance, all the religions of the world are talking about meanings that lie behind the physical world. Now, how are you going to operationalize that into, like, I'm going to start a religion where we just look for the hidden meanings behind the physical world. Like, direction, please? Where? What's that? So if you think about it, for instance, trying to fit into a pluralistic scheme is one of my favorite examples, because we're mostly familiar with it, Christianity, and Theravada Buddhism. Like in Christianity, the prevailing view is that my identity is my soul, and it has an eternal career. By the way, that hasn't always been the majority view in Christianity. Like before Augustine, when Christians believed what Jews believed, which is that you die and they put you in the ground in your body, you're nowhere until the resurrection. But the prevailing view after Augustine is, there's my identity is my soul, God, personal being, right? In Theravada Buddhism, the example I like to use is that the Western concept of identity is like an avocado. Like when you peel off there's a hard kernel of reality at the middle. That's like, the soul, that's the real you. In Theravada Buddhism, the view is more like an onion. If you peel it and peel it and peel all the layers, by the time you peel all the layers, there's nothing left. That's the whole idea though. Over here, salvation is about the preservation of identity, the continuity of identity in eternal life. Over here, salvation is about extinguishing personal identity. Now, how are you going to fit those in the same jar? They just are very different sort of temperaments about what seems comforting. And I have to tell you, I'm not talking here as a philosopher, I'm just talking as a human being and, about my own temperament. I've always been, okay, I grew up in a really hardcore Lutheran church. I went to the catechism class I was supposed to go to. I read the stuff that none of the other kids read. I had questions, got sent in the hall every class we had. I mean, one of the questions I had is, okay, I want to talk about eternal life. Now, bear in mind, this is eternal life. Okay, we're gonna like go praise God. I could see like maybe 1,000 years of that, but crap. What is there going to be to do? Like, I always found, I know this is weird, but I always found the idea of extinction a lot more comforting and meaningful because it means it sort of brought into relief that my existence in this life, I better hook it up, which is one reason why I have a degree in music. because life is too short not to spend it like doing and learning, right? So yeah, I think some of that is a temperament issue, and maybe that's what we need to factor in when people talk about how they're spiritual. Maybe what they're really talking about is a kind of temperamental disposition. And I'm sorry, I just talked about you for so long. I'm sorry.
The question of do you believe in God? There's also the problem. What do you mean by believe?
There is a very significant problem there, which I've completely glossed over. But I used to teach, this is going to blow your mind. I used to teach a course in a seminary. It was a mini course that was part of a credit in seminary called Knowing, Believing, and Having Faith. And we would try to disentangle what those different states mean and how they're related to each other. For instance, can you know something and believe something at the same time in the same way? Or is it the case that knowing something is a stronger version of believing something? That's what Plato thought. Like Plato thought that the state of belief is having true opinion, but not understanding why the opinion. So you're absolutely right, but we just don't have that kind of time.
And just asking that question, if somebody asked me that, I would have to say, well, you're going to have to ask a different question. Do I think that there's a possibility that such a thing as a God could exist?
Yeah.
And so that would narrow down the answer choices. I said, no, I don't think so.
What's interesting though is when people ask that question, first of all, you don't always know what. I mean, don't take offense to anybody because I've spent a large part of my life sorting through these kinds of issues. But you don't know the level of sophistication behind a question like you do. And it means something different when it's coming from different people. Like I recently had a conversation with a colleague of mine who's a very good philosopher, and he's interested in some of the same stuff that I'm interested in. Like most of these conversations, we had beer, so we're drinking beer, and at one point in the conversation, he said, I've always wondered about this. I'm going to ask you this. Do you believe in God? Well, coming from him, that question was loaded with a lot of, like, I want to hear the metaphysics. I want, epistemology, metaphysics. I want it. give me the whole load. Whereas, you know, when I run into somebody on the vegetable aisle, how does that come up? But have you ever had, you're on the vegetable aisle and somebody's like, oh, do you believe in God? Do you want a carrot? I mean, it's, but these kind of things do come up. And when they do, my answer is a way of opening a door to a conversation. And maybe somebody's interested in, you know, what does it mean? What does belief mean? There's a really famous interview with Carl Jung, you know, the psychologist, the renegade psychoanalyst guy. And at the end of the interview, I forget who was doing the interview, but somebody said, do you believe in God? And Jung said, I don't believe, I know. And that was it. He didn't go on. He was like, I know, okay, but what is it you know? Like, can you finish the sentence? Because we'd like to know what it is you know. So anyway, but he didn't finish the sentence. But that is an illustration of how sometimes the question is framed in a way that's got all kinds of ambiguities in it that have to be sorted out before you can get to a meeting.
But at some point, don't you have to just make an assumption like yes or no? I mean, if somebody asks me that question, I know what my answer will be, and I'm not going to take too much time to think about where they're coming from.
Well, no, but it depends on, yeah, see, but that's, I'm like an inveterate philosophy teacher. So I welcome these opportunities with people and I really enjoy, you know, I'm sort of like, I'm fascinated by what people believe about things in a way that's kind of like Socrates. Only, you know, they executed him, so there is that. You know, if it had been in their power, my sisters would have given me hemlock because they thought I was just embarrassing. Like no matter what public function we would be at, I'd always be over there grilling somebody about their worldview or something. And because I was just fascinated by this stuff. Yes.
And how does this?
Yeah, I was going to get to that. So remember, this is a theory and practice discussion. So here's a practice. So first of all, what is philosophical counseling? Philosophical counseling is basically like the use of the tools and methods of philosophy, and sometimes the content too, in a counseling kind of situation. And I have clients who have all kinds of different reasons for coming to philosophical counseling that range from I want to learn how to think more clearly so I can communicate more clearly. That's a reasonable. I have a lot of people who want value clarification. This was a big thing in the 90s. And, you know, because people thought if I clarify what my values are, then I'll be like a more moral person. Doesn't work like that. That's not really how that goes. But that's one of the things that we talk about. Another large part of philosophical counseling, the way I do it, is metaphysics. It's about worldviews. It's about your ideas about who you are and how you understand yourself in a larger context. And why is that useful and practical? Well, ironically, I just had a query from a person who's like, I think I'm having a midlife crisis. Do you think you could talk to me about, you know, like what I want to do with my remaining heartbeats? If you think about it, many of the questions that people have that lead them into traditional psychotherapy either are or have philosophical dimensions to them. So philosophical counseling is not a substitute for mental health kind of therapy. It's a complement. And in some cases, people don't actually need psychotherapy. They need to talk to somebody who can help them clarify, you know, what their beliefs are. So I want to tell you about years ago. I had a client who who had a series of experiences that led to him losing his faith in God and religion. He'd grown up Catholic, he was pretty serious about it, but he had a series of experiences. The details are irrelevant. And he wanted at the time, I was still, so yes, I have a degree in music theory and I've done music, but I also, in the first like real adult job that I had, I trained are you ready for this? Take a breath. I trained as a psychoanalyst and I had a practice. orthodox psychoanalytic psychotherapist for about 60 years. So I'm very familiar with what is official mental health. But what this guy wanted was, I don't want somebody who's gonna, like sift through my childhood. I don't need that. I don't want any of that. That's not my problem. My problem is I've lost my faith that has sort of given me a orientation in the world. And I want to know how to live now. I don't know what to do with my time. I want, so what he was really looking for, if you think about it, is he was looking for a worldview that made sense to him. Now, why would you want to talk to a person about issues like, worldview, religion, and all that kind of stuff, who is a conceptual atheist? So let me package this in the form of a little story. Suppose you, as a little role play, suppose you had a medical problem. You have an ailment and you want somebody to give you a treatment for it. Would you prefer a physician who's already decided before meeting you and talking to you and getting to know you and finding out about your ailment, what the treatment is supposed to be, because that's how the treatment is for this thing? Or would you like a physician who's going to meet with you and talk to you and find out about your ailment and give you a range of options and equip you so that you can think about what you want for yourself? Now, my money's on that approach. And that's why talking to a conceptual atheist, my conceptual atheism is not evangelical. Like I'm not trying to convince all of you, let's all be conceptual atheists. It's right for me because I'm a philosopher. I've thought about this stuff. I wanted to work this out for myself, but I have in my philosophical practice, but also in life, I have a really firm commitment to other people exercising autonomy. By the way, this is probably the most political thing I'm going to say today. One of the reasons that I would have paid you to come do this lecture is, I'm not getting paid for this, but I'm just saying, I would have paid to come do this because I genuinely believe that people need the space and the equilibrium to make up their own minds about religion and not have it imposed on you. And even though the Freedom from Religion Foundation's official position is the church and separation of church and state idea, the philosophical principle underneath separation of church and state is every human being deserves the autonomy to decide what they believe. But it does not follow from the fact that you have the autonomy that everything anybody believes is equally worthy of being believed. So I also think that we have to educate people and equip people to exercise their autonomy so that they thrive in their lives, so that they have a life of flourishing instead of a life where they're being told what to believe and how to believe it and when to believe it. Right? So I'm very much aligned with the philosophical aspiration of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And that's why I do stuff like this. I do stuff. And in my philosophical counseling practice, I don't conceal anything from me. I don't tell people that I'm a theist, so that they feel more comfortable. We have an open conversation about this. And I underline time and again that, people deserve this, as what I said, the space and the equilibrium. You know what I mean by equanimity, like they deserve not to be pressured. They deserve to have. I guess maybe this will be the most political. See, how we have this is very, I mean this partly facetiously, but you can't vote till you're a certain age. You can't buy alcohol till you're a certain age. You can't buy cigarettes at a certain age. You shouldn't be allowed in religion when you're a certain age. Just cut it off. And then when people are, they'll be equipped to be, instead of being sort of like, I'm gonna just bring people up a certain way, teach them to believe a certain thing. And I'm saying this because the part of this that's not facetious is because in my time, I'm just gonna make this assertion, I'll talk more about it if you want. In my time as an orthodox psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and continuing on after I became renegade for a while, and then I became a philosophical counselor, the number one thing that people are conflicted about when they go into therapy and so on is, or has to do with religion in some way. So think about it. When I was in mental health, I had, most of my practice was identity disorder, because that's what psychoanalysts tend to do. And you have somebody who comes in and they're like super conflicted because they're gay. And what is it they're conflicted about? Well, you know, my parents don't want me to be gay. And these little traces lead back to, quite often, lead back to a religious perspective about identity and sexuality. So, I mean, for me, that's the thing. I'm on that. So why would you want to talk to a conceptual atheist about belief system? You would want to talk to a conceptual atheist because the open-endedness of the conceptual atheism means that I haven't already decided in advance what the right answer is. I'm willing to let you find the right answer, and I'm also willing to provide whatever I can by way of the tools and knowledge. For some people, that's reading philosophy. For a lot of people, we don't ever read any philosophy. We just do philosophy like life in real life. So there you go. Fun stuff. Yeah, talk to me.
How does this work across different languages? For example, I'm studying Polish, and because I'm interested in this stuff, a lot of the stuff I do in Polish is related to this. And I was talking to my tutor one day, and we were trying to figure out the right word to use, and I wanted to use the word heaven, and she used the word sky. I said, sky and heaven are different words. And she said, no, in Polish, they're the same word.
Yes.
So things like that come across when you're doing different languages. So then do different languages have different conceptions of God, or is it if it's semantics, or is it different word choice? So how does that work with different languages?
Yeah, that is a really fascinating question. And let me start a small answer by telling you that in New Testament Greek, that word is also sky, Uranos. For instance, the phrase, the kingdom of the heavens, or the kingdom of heaven, is Uranos. It literally means the sky.
Oh.
And so what happens is we give it a metaphorical sort of meaning, right? But it isn't just semantics. See, I always hate it when people say, oh, that's like my thing about conceptual analysis before you start asserting existence. Oh, that's all semantics. We do have to worry about that because the way we are using the words and the cultural loading behind the words that we choose for things cannot be, that they're inextricably bound together. So when you're speaking a language and learning a language, you're actually learning a culture, which always has aspects of worldview built into it. So there's no really simple answer to that. If you want some really interesting and entertaining sort of discussion of this, you have a look at the history of translating the Bible, the New Testament, into non-Western languages and the choices that people had to make. Like when people were translating the New Testament into Swahili, you have to make choices about what is going to resonate culturally with people. And you can find these accounts of those kinds of translation problems. But this is what makes translating such a culture-bound activity. Translating is very, very difficult. And we've even had problems. Well, let me illustrate this. When I taught at seminary, I used to teach, I taught several different things, but one of the courses that was very entertaining and popular was, I did a little mini course on translating scripture, Hebrew and Greek. You know, the Old Testament was Hebrew, some Aramaic, Hebrew and Greek, New Testament too. And I used to keep a list of theologically motivated mistranslations. So if you, and this is bound to happen, right? But if you think about it, you've got somebody who's going to translate some sentence in the Bible. They're going to translate it, and they themselves typically hold a view of the stuff, like they're a believer in something, right? So the translation is influenced by what you already believe. Let me give you just one example. Psalm 8, this is the psalm that says, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is that." This is the King James translation. "How excellent is thy name in all the earth." And then it gets about verse 9 or 10, it goes something like, for what is man, this is the King James translation. "For what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? But thou hast made him a little lower than the angels." Well, if you look at this psalm in Hebrew, it's unequivocally saying, "For thou hast made him a little lower than God." It's just there in Hebrew. But when it was translated by Jerome, I think that was the 2nd century, which has become kind of the standard Latin from the Vulgate. Jerome's theology was such that he just couldn't believe that human beings were created that close to God. So he stuck a level in, like, we'll just put angels in there. And that's just everywhere. If you read these scriptures in Hebrew and Greek, there are all kinds of choices that are made, and the choices that are made based on something. And often they're made based on a prevailing theological view. And when they are, then you get subtle, but sometimes very important, we could call them mistranslations, but translations of things. And that happens no matter what language, no matter what culture, because that's how inextricably bound together culture and language. There's no way to disentangle. So, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, dude, talk to me.
Well, now you have me thinking that every translation is almost like a reflection of the current culture, you know, and I'm also taking a comparative religion class on top of this one. I enjoy the overlap, by the way.
Yeah.
And it's all, and that kind of plays into now, like every religion is a reflection of the culture, you know. So in a way, like when you start to have like new translations of, like, let's say the Bible, it's almost like there's like a cultural bias being reflected into the new translation, you know. So like the original Hebrew probably had a lot of attitudes about the history and the culture, and then it gets translated, and now it's like, oh well, we think like this now, so let's kind of put, like, it's not a direct translation like you say, they're putting like a cultural bias translation into every translation, but also at the same time, I think it's a good reflection on the current culture, the history, the attitude, and so on and so forth. So.
No, you're right about that. Every translation, this is what I try to reinforce with every translation is an interpretation package. A translation. That's inescapable. Because I translate Aristotle a lot, right? Even in something like philosophy, my translations of Aristotle are informed by the fact that I've spent 35 years reading Aristotle on a continuous loop. Right, and it's inescapable that every there is no such thing as a literal translation of it. There's not even there's actually speaking like we are now. How many times in this very lecture have I used metaphors to convey something that I'm talking about? That's not literal language either, and I'm expecting you to interpret the metaphor in a way that is consistent with what I'm trying to convey. So you're absolutely right. And if you think about it, then people often ask me, well, what do we do? Like, how do I read, for instance, the Bible in a way that tells me what the Bible actually said? And you have basically two options. One, learn Hebrew and Greek and hook it up. It takes time, but that's the only way. It's like, I learned classical Greek because I wanted to look Aristotle straight in the face without somebody in between me and Aristotle telling me what Aristotle thought. And even then it's hard to know what he's talking about because, you know, he didn't say it was not like a brain dump where he said every single thing with every connotation. Kind of nuts. So one option is learn the languages and look them in the face, and then wrestle with all the problems of translation. And another next best is get as many different translations as you can get a hold of and compare them against each other, because then you're going to get multiple layers of interpretation, and some are going to be enlightening because they will. So like, for instance, in general, translations of the Psalms for the Hebrew Bible keep God in the Psalm 8 passage that I just talked about, in general. So if you line those up next to each other, you'll ask yourself some questions, right? But yeah. And it's also important to notice that you want your, if you're going to take method B, which I recommend anyway, I mean, it's just fascinating. The King James translation is not just, ooh, let's talk about Shakespeare, make it sound biblical. It's not just that. It's also a reflection of the attitudes and beliefs of that time period. And that is a fascinating layer. It's almost like intellectual archaeology, right? When you read the King James, you're not just reading, oh, this is what the Bible says. You're reading what a bunch of Elizabethan people thought the Bible was telling them. That all, so yes, it
Also
reflects
based on the
their,
power that they.
well, there's
Yeah.
also that,
Yeah.
yeah, see that. And actually, maybe I'll conclude with this. Let me tell you a fascinating story. So Jesus didn't write anything down. He taught. He was known as a teacher. He taught. There were lots of collections of Jesus' kingdom parables and sayings that were passed around in the early Christian communities. Different communities had their favorite collections. And then when it became evident to the early Christian community that Jesus was not imminently returning and the reign of God was not going to start right away, the attention of the early Christian communities turned to institution building because they needed a way for the religion to survive. And it was not an institution like Jesus didn't say, okay, everybody build a church here. We're going to found a church. Jesus was like this itinerant preacher dude who went around and Jesus is a really good philosopher if you decontextualize the kingdom parables from. If you want to know more about that little project, I'll be happy to tell you. So here's what happened. Collections of Jesus taught probably in Aramaic mostly. These sayings and kingdom parables were preserved, like the Gospel of Thomas. It's just a collection of sayings. It doesn't have a bunch of narrative in it. It's just, Jesus said this, said this, said. And then the New Testament books take this material, translate it into Greek, and place it into a context where the dominant theme in the New Testament is institution building. If you're familiar with this literature, think about all of the Pauline epistles, both the genuine ones and the pseudo epistles. What are they all about? They all answer questions about how the institution of Christianity is going to function. Like how do you decide this, and what do you do about that, and what? So if you think about it, then what's happened is you've got two weird kinds of translation going on simultaneously. You've got Jesus' teachings preserved in Aramaic being translated into Greek. And then you've got a cultural translation where Jesus' teachings are being used to support a project of institutionalization that Jesus did not talk about. And that's weird and fascinating. And so if you want to get a little closer to what Jesus' teaching was like, what you have to do is pluck the kingdom parables and sayings out of their narrative context in the synoptic gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and read them with each other, see how they resonate with each other. Yeah, that's a fascinating project. I can't even tell how many hours have I spent doing. I have translated. I've done exactly this project. I've got all the kingdom parables taken out of context, all of their parallels in the Gospel of Thomas, and some other testimony, and because I really wanted, what I wanted to look this teacher in the face. So I've done all the translating myself. It's really fascinating. And I've learned a lot of really fascinating stuff by doing it. Yeah, it's cool. It's a cool project. All right, so I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. And do you know what is so great about this? I talk about things that I'm interested in. And I don't have to grade any paper. With the exception. Yes. No, if you're my students, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate this. It's beyond the call of duty. I really appreciate it. Like I said, everybody else, they've had a whole semester dose of me. You'd think they'd be sick of it. Thank you for coming.
I understand why they wouldn't be sick. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you. Are all of you signed in? What I'm going to do is follow up with a little message to you about what this extra credit thing is. It's a very light lift. Want to hear from you about what you heard today. Okay? And everybody else, I sincerely appreciate your reception and your kindness and your generosity. And more, thank you for inviting me to do this. Like I said, I would have paid to get to do it. Thanks.
We need to
Thank
sign
you.
a paper.
Just, if you'll just, I mean, I know you're here, but if you'll sign in for my record keeping, yeah, I'll send you something. Thanks a lot.
I used to have students ask me what my religion was, and I would tell them for a while, I'm an atheist, and they said, well, you're an atheist? I said, no, I don't care.